She was too short to reach the controls. That is what the flying club in Gomel told her. Polina Gelman, a Jewish girl who had grown up reading history, who had spent her school years imagining a future as an academic, who had taken flying lessons at that same club as a teenager because something in the motion of aircraft over the Soviet steppe moved her in a way she could not explain. Too short, that was the verdict. 4 years later, Polina Gelman had flown 857 combat missions over Nazi-occupied territory. She had dropped 113 tons of bombs on the enemy. She had flown through searchlights, through anti-aircraft fire, through winters so cold that instruments froze in the cockpit. She had flown 18 sorties in a single night. The Germans had a name for her regiment, not a military designation. A name. They called them the Nachtwechseln, the Night Witches. And here is the thing about that name. The Germans gave it to them in fear, not contempt, because contempt does not keep you awake at night. Contempt does not make you tell stories. Fear does. Hitler had built his entire political system on a single claim, that Jews could not fight, that they were biologically incapable of valor, that the Jewish people were a cowardly race, hiding behind money and politics and manipulation rather than standing on a battlefield. Polina Gelman's flight log was the refutation of that claim, written in altitude and bomb weight and sorties flown and hours in the air. If you want to know the stories this channel uncovers every week, the ones the history books forgot to tell, subscribe now. Because the story of what 1.5 million Jewish soldiers did to the ideology that said they could not fight is the story Hitler never wanted told. This is that story. To understand why Jewish soldiers terrified the Nazi system, you need to understand what the Nazi system was built on. Not just hatred. Hatred alone doesn't build governments or armies or industrial programs of mass murder. What built the Third Reich was a story, a very specific story, told with precision and repetition, and the full weight of a modern propaganda apparatus behind it. The story went like this. Germany had not lost the First World War on the battlefield. Germany had been stabbed in the back, betrayed from within by Jews and communists who had sabotaged the war effort, undermined the government, and handed victory to the Allies from inside the German state. The German army, brave and undefeated in the field, had been sold out by cowards who refused to fight. This was the Dolchstoß legend, the stab-in-the-back legend. And at the center of it always were the Jews. Adolf Hitler encountered this story in Vienna before the war, absorbed it during his years as a soldier, and crystallized it in Mein Kampf. In that book, Jews were not merely undesirable. They were the architects of Germany's humiliation. They were the reason France had won. They were the Marxist operators behind the Bolshevik Revolution, the financial manipulators behind the Allied war effort, the cowardly draft dodgers who had let real Germans die in the trenches while they stayed safe in rear area postings. The problem with this story was that it was a provable lie. The German government had known it was a lie since 1916. That year, responding to exactly this kind of anti-Semitic propaganda, the German military had conducted a formal census. The Judenzählung, the count of Jews. The idea was to prove what the right-wing nationalists claimed, that Jews were underrepresented at the front, hiding in offices and supply lines while ethnic Germans did the fighting. The census proved the opposite. The proportion of Jews serving at the front was proportionate to their share of the German population. Jewish soldiers were dying in the same percentages as anyone else. The results were never made public. Instead, they were buried, and the lie was allowed to grow. By 1919, it had become myth. By 1925, it was scripture, printed in Mein Kampf and sold across a humiliated, economically desperate nation that needed someone to blame. Jewish veterans organizations published their own counterstatement. It read, 12,000 Jewish soldiers died on the battlefields for the fatherland. Christian and Jewish heroes fought together and rest together in foreign soil. That memorial was later destroyed by the Nazis. Because you cannot build a system on a lie, and then allow the evidence that disproves the lie to stand in public. Here is the architectural contradiction at the heart of Nazi ideology that mattered most for this story. Hitler simultaneously claimed two things about Jews that cannot both be true. Claim 1. Jews were racial cowards, biologically incapable of military valor, parasites who had always hidden behind others rather than fighting. Claim 2. Jews were the most dangerous existential force in human history, controlling the Soviet state through Bolshevism, controlling the Western democracies through finance and media, capable of engineering the destruction of the entire Aryan civilization. A race of cowards does not control the Soviet Red Army. A community of parasites does not threaten Western democracy. The claims destroyed each other. But the ideology needed both. It needed Jews to be weak enough to be destroyed without guilt, and it needed Jews to be powerful enough to justify the destruction. The soldiers who left for the front in 1939, 1941, 1942, the Jewish men and women in Soviet uniforms, British uniforms, Polish uniforms, American uniforms, they were not just fighting a war. Every single one of them, by existing as a soldier, was a walking refutation of the foundational lie of the Third Reich. And the Nazi propaganda machine knew it. It just couldn't say so out loud. By the summer of 1942, the German Eastern Front was the largest military campaign in human history. The Wehrmacht was fighting the Red Army across thousands of kilometers of Soviet territory, advancing toward Moscow, toward Stalingrad, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. At night, the sky over German rear area positions was not safe. A regiment of Soviet aircraft, slow, fragile, wood-end canvas biplanes originally designed as training planes, had developed a tactic that was driving German anti-aircraft crews to the edge of their nerves. The aircraft would approach silently, engines idled to near silence, gliding toward the target with nothing but the wind in the wires to signal their presence. Then the bombs fell. German soldiers began hearing stories about these aircraft. They didn't have a military designation for them. They gave them a name from folklore. Nachtshexen, night witches. Because only a witch could appear from nowhere in darkness and vanish before the guns could find her. The 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment was an all-female Soviet unit. Among its navigators was Polina Gelman, the Jewish girl from Berdyshev who had been told she was too short to fly. In a letter to her mother, written before she first flew combat missions, Gelman had said, "Mummy, my dear one, I have decided to go to the front. I am a daughter of the Jewish people and I have a particular account to settle with Hitler." That letter is preserved in the Russian State Archive. It is a primary document, not a legend. And it matters not because it is dramatic, though it is, but because of what it tells us about the interior lives of Jewish soldiers fighting this war. Gelman was not merely a Soviet patriot. She was explicit about her Jewish identity as an additional reason for fighting. She had a specific account to settle with a specific man. Over 3 years, she settled it. 857 combat sorties. That is not a number you reach by accident or by luck. That is a number you reach through more than 1,000 hours of flying in darkness, navigating by stars and memorized landmarks, dropping through anti-aircraft fire, returning to base, refueling, returning to the sky. One night she flew 18 sorties, the work of an entire squadron compressed into the hours of darkness by a single navigator who would not stop. In one night in August 1942, after standard orders had been completed, Gelman's crew spotted German fuel tanks near a railway station below them. The tanks were not the mission. They dropped their remaining ordnance on them anyway. The resulting fire destroyed thousands of tons of enemy fuel, bridges destroyed, anti-aircraft guns silenced, searchlights extinguished. enemy vehicles burning on the road to the front. The Germans who experienced this had no ideological framework for it. Their entire system told them that Jewish people were cowards. The navigator dropping bombs on their fuel supply from a biplane in the darkness did not fit that category. On 15 May 1946, Polina Gelman received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award, the highest military honor in the Red Army. She was one of more than 150 Jewish soldiers to receive that decoration, one of more than 160,000 Jewish Red Army soldiers, at all levels of command, who earned citations during the war. More than 150 heroes of the Soviet Union, Jewish. The ideological system that said this could not happen had to keep murdering people faster than the evidence could accumulate. The number is almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. 1.5 million. That is the approximate number of Jewish men and women who served in Allied military forces during the Second World War. Not partisans, not resistance fighters, soldiers in uniform, in formal military structures under recognized flags, fighting on every front where the war was decided. Let the breakdown make it concrete. In the United States Army, approximately 550,000 Jewish soldiers served. They were 4.23% of all American military personnel, and this matters because anti-Semitic propaganda in America, like in Germany, had long claimed Jews avoided military service. Jewish service members were proportionately represented and proportionately killed. Approximately 11,000 died. More than 36,000 received citations for service and valor. In the Red Army, between 350,000 and 500,000 Jewish soldiers fought. Approximately 120,000 were killed in combat or died in the line of duty. A further 80,000 Jewish soldiers taken prisoner were murdered by the Germans, not killed in combat, murdered after capture, in direct violation of every convention governing the treatment of prisoners of war. The Germans murdered Jewish prisoners of war because the ideology demanded it, even when those prisoners were wearing Soviet military uniforms and had been captured in battle as soldiers. In Poland, approximately 100,000 Jews fought in the army at the outbreak of the war in September 1939. They were 10% of the Polish military, precisely proportionate to the Jewish share of the Polish population. Approximately 30,000 were killed, captured, or went missing defending Poland. 11,000 of those losses occurred in the defense of Warsaw alone. In the British Army, 30,000 Jews served across the war. Some of them were refugees from Germany itself, men who had fled the Reich and then turned around and come back as soldiers in the army that was going to defeat it. And there is one unit among all of these that deserves to be held separately, because what it represented was not merely military service. What it represented was something the Nazi ideological system genuinely could not process. In September 1944, the British Army formally established the Jewish Brigade Group. 5,000 Jewish volunteers from British Mandatory Palestine, 3 infantry battalions, artillery regiment, engineering and transport units, commanded by Brigadier Ernest Benjamin, a Canadian-born Jewish officer. They were deployed to Italy in November 1944. Winston Churchill had fought for the brigade's creation for years. In a telegram to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he wrote that the Jews of all races have the right to strike at the Germans as a recognizable body. Roosevelt replied, "I perceive no objection." What made the Jewish Brigade different from every other military unit in this war was a single detail. They fought under a Jewish flag, the Star of David on blue and white, the only military force in the entire conflict to do so. Think about what that meant. Across the line in Italy in the spring of 1945, German forces were facing an army that was explicitly, visibly, institutionally Jewish. Not Jewish soldiers embedded in other national armies, fighting as Soviets or Americans or British, fighting as Jews under a Jewish flag, with a Jewish identity that had not been hidden or diluted or subsumed. The system that said Jews could not fight had placed soldiers in the field who could look across the wire and see, with their own eyes, 5,000 of them doing exactly that. When the Jewish Brigade engaged German forces in the Battle of the Senio River and in Operation Grapeshot, the final Allied offensive in Italy, 57 of those soldiers died. They died as Jewish soldiers, under a Jewish flag, fighting the army that was simultaneously murdering their families in the camps. In 2018, the Italian parliament voted unanimously to award the Brigade Italy's Gold Medal for military valor, one of the country's highest honors. The ceremony was held in Israel. Many of those who fought were long dead by then, but the grandsons and granddaughters were there. The Nazi propaganda machine was sophisticated. Joseph Goebbels understood mass communication in ways that were genuinely ahead of his time. The apparatus he controlled produced films, newspapers, posters, radio broadcasts, and public spectacles designed to shape how millions of people understood the world. It could not do the one thing that would have resolved its central contradiction. It could not acknowledge that Jewish soldiers existed. The 1916 German census had proved proportionate Jewish military service. The results were suppressed. The Jewish Veterans Memorial noting 12,000 dead was destroyed. The evidence that Jewish Germans had fought and died for their country was systematically erased because the ideology required an alternative history in which they had not. By 1942, as Jewish soldiers were fighting on every front, the propaganda machine had to intensify the Jewish Bolshevism framing, the claim that Jews controlled the Soviet military machine, precisely because it could not acknowledge that individual Jews were fighting as soldiers without shattering the cowardice myth. The solution was to make Jewish military capacity into a threat rather than a fact. Jews weren't fighting bravely. Jews were orchestrating, conspiring, pulling strings at the highest levels of enemy governments. But the soldiers in the field knew otherwise. German soldiers who encountered the night witches bombing their supply lines did not see a global conspiracy. They saw aircraft coming out of darkness, dropping bombs, and escaping before the guns could find them. They gave those pilots a name from folklore because what they were experiencing did not fit any category their ideology had prepared them for. Jewish Red Army soldiers captured by the Wehrmacht were murdered rather than processed as prisoners of war. This is documented in German military records from Operation Barbarossa onward. The decision to murder Jewish prisoners, men in Soviet uniform, captured in battle, entitled to protections under every convention governing the conduct of war, was an ideological decision, not a military one. The Geneva Convention applied. The ideology overrode it. That decision reveals something. You do not murder prisoners because you believe they are cowardly and weak. You murder prisoners because you are afraid of what they represent. Because allowing them to survive in a prison camp means allowing the evidence to survive that contradicts the system you have built. The 80,000 Jewish Red Army soldiers murdered after capture were not killed because they were a threat as prisoners. They were killed because they were a threat as proof. Germany surrendered in May 1945. When the Jewish Brigade came out of Italy, they did not go home. They remained in Europe, officially to assist Holocaust survivors and displaced persons, to help establish camps for refugees, to help people find whatever remained of their families. Many found nothing. The survivors the brigade soldiers met at the Italian border with Austria and Yugoslavia told them what had happened. What we found were just bits and pieces. There were no communities, no families. There were individuals out of this 6-year horror. Those words were spoken by a brigade veteran decades after the fact. Within the brigade, a unit formed that the British commanders did not officially know about. It was called Gmal, the Hebrew word for recompense. Using false identities and British military police uniforms, Brigade soldiers obtained from a German informant a list of SS officers and war criminals who had returned to civilian life. Over 3 months, between 100 and 200 of those men were found and killed. When the British military detected the disappearances and understood what had been happening, they did not investigate. They redeployed the brigade to Belgium and the Netherlands. No Jewish brigade soldier was ever tried for those operations. The brigade was formally disbanded in 1946. Most of its soldiers returned to mandatory Palestine. Many of those veterans went directly into the structures that would become the Israel Defense Forces. 2 future IDF chiefs of staff, Mordechai Maklev and Haim Laskov, had served in the brigade. Polina Gelman retired from active military service as a major in 1957. She went back to teaching, eventually at the Institute of Social Sciences in Moscow. Her memoirs were published in 1982. At the flying club in Gomel that had once told her she was too short to reach the controls, there is now a flagstone carrying the names of all members who were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal. Her name is the only woman's name on it. She died in Moscow on 25 November 2005. She was buried near her mother's grave at Novodevichy Cemetery. The account she had promised to settle with Hitler, the particular account she had written about in that letter before she flew her first mission, she settled it 857 times over. There is a detail from the research into the 1916 German census, the Judenzählung, that I want to leave you with, because I think it is the most important thing in this entire story. The German government conducted the census because anti-Semitic groups were claiming Jews avoided military service. The census proved those groups wrong. The evidence was clear, documented, official, produced by the German state itself. And the government suppressed it. Not because they didn't know what it showed, because they did know. They knew the evidence would not change the minds of the people who needed to believe the lie. They knew that a documented truth, officially released, would simply be dismissed, reinterpreted, or ignored by people who had built their identity around the alternative. So they buried it instead. That is not a story about the past. That is a story about the structure of propaganda, about what happens when a system requires a lie to function, and the evidence arrives that disproves the lie, and the system chooses the lie over the evidence. Nazi ideology required Jews to be cowards. 1.5 million soldiers in Allied uniforms proved they were not. The ideology did not update. It accelerated. It murdered faster. It suppressed the evidence more aggressively. It renamed the soldiers as conspirators rather than acknowledged them as fighters. And in the end, Polina Gelman flew her 857th sortie, and the Jewish Brigade marched under a Jewish flag in Italy, and the Red Army crossed into Berlin, and the system that said it could not happen had collapsed into rubble. The Jewish Veterans Memorial from 1919, the one that said 12,000 Jewish soldiers had died for Germany, was destroyed by the Nazis. It said something true. That was the problem. The response to propaganda that suppresses true things is not silence. It is not modesty. It is not waiting for the system to acknowledge the evidence on its own. The response is to keep flying. 857 times.